Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Todd McLay, congratulations on your appointment, and I hope it goes well for you. Mr Speaker, Labor Party is supporting this bill to select committee. There are some issues that we want to check on, particularly around the retrospective nature of the changes to the taxation of foreign superannuation vehicles. That the case against retrospectivity is normally very, very high. And we want to make sure that what is happening here is proper. Mr Speaker, both the last speaker and Todd McLay in his opening address said that the taxation system should be efficient and fair, and then said that this bill achieved that. Mr Speaker, it's interesting to reflect upon what the OECD said in respect of New Zealand's tax system in the OECD Economic Survey, June 2013, just this month. The latest in a number of international advice from the international agencies like the IMF and the OECD to critique New Zealand's taxation system. And I want to read out what it says, because it says the opposite of what the Minister and the last speaker said. And it says that tax changes should be considered to make the tax system more conducive to both growth and equity. The changes that they proposed, which are supported by the Labor Party, are very, very significant. It's interesting that they go to both improve equity in our country and to increase the wealth of our country through more growth. But before they set out their prescription, they note that New Zealand has now one of the least redistributive tax systems in the OECD. One of the least. And that's one of the reasons that they say that the rate of growth in inequality in New Zealand has been amongst the highest in the OECD in the last 2 decades. Now, I think both of those, I say those two things slowly because I think they'll shock most New Zealanders to realise that the rate of growth of inequality in New Zealand is worse than in most OECD developed countries, and that we as a country, as a consequence, are becoming less equal. And then what they don't go down to is they don't actually sort of go into how this government's made it worse, because it's a prospective-looking document rather than criticising the government's recent policy platform. But of course inequalities got worse in New Zealand under this government when 40% of their income tax cuts went to the top 10%. And they say, oh, but they increased GST. Of course, GST is effectively a tax on wages if you're a low or middle income person and you spend all your income. You pay GST on everything except your interest and your rent. So you pay quite a high effective rate of GST in relation to your income. But if you're a wealthy person and you save a lot of your income, you don't use all of your income up on GST-related services, and your effective rate of GST is lower as a proportion of your income than it is for a lower middle income person. So the effect of those tax cuts, which gave 40% of the income tax cuts to the top 10% of income earners, and then effectively replaced it with some GST, which proportionately fell more on low and middle income groups, was to increase inequality markedly. And I say markedly. And we see that the effect of that in Auckland property prices. The government, as its centrepiece of this budget, says, oh, we've now got to do something about unaffordable house prices. But they're driving it both with the tax system, which is what I'm going to come back to next, and with the increase in inequality as a consequence of more and more of New Zealand's resources, New Zealand's wealth, being captured by the top 5 or 10% of New Zealand. And they, of course, are the people that are out there bidding for a third or fourth home, while younger people are closed out of owning even one. So what do they say in terms of reforms, the OECD, that could make this better, that, in their words, could make the tax system more conducive to both growth and equity? I'll read it out. It says, New Zealand belongs to a group of 5 OECD countries with particularly high pre-tax capital income inequality. As much of this income, especially at the top levels, takes the form of capital gains, the lack of a capital gains tax in New Zealand exacerbates inequality by reducing the redistributive power of taxation. It also reinforces a bias towards speculative housing investments and undermines housing affordability as they argued in their 2011 survey, which is a wee flick at the government saying, why do you ask us for these reviews and pay for them if you're going to ignore them like you did the 2011 one? So they're saying that we're one of only 5 OECD countries which has this capital income inequality, because we tax a subset of economic income based on a statutory definition of income, not an economic definition of income. So we're one of 5 OECD countries that do that. And then it says, as much of this capital income takes the form of capital gains, the lack of a capital gains tax exacerbates inequality. Well, I thought the Minister told us that that's what they were aiming for, was a fair tax system rather than an unfair one. And then they say it reinforces a bias towards speculative housing, which we know is probably one of the largest economic problems that we have in New Zealand, that we overinvest in speculative land-based investments and we underinvest in the productive economy, the manufacturers and the like, who export products that pay for our imports and interests. So then the OECD says, well, let's talk about this in respect of growth. And it says, the OECD says that recurrent taxes on immovable property are the tax category least harmful to long-term growth. So they're saying that some taxing property, taxing capital, is effectively what they're saying, is less, has less negative effects on growth than other forms of taxation. So they are saying that the thing that New Zealand could do, and it stands out clearly, that they're effectively their standout recommendation as to how to improve both the economy and to improve inequality, is to fix this glaring hole in our tax system where capital income is not taxed, despite the fact that it is economic income. Now, Mr. Speaker, really, I should sit down there, because that points to the most glaring hole in New Zealand's economic settings. There is nothing more important that this government could do economically than to get the investment signal right, so that people invest on the basis of the productivity of their investment rather than a tax bias, because there is a tax bias there. No one disagrees now that there's a tax bias. The Prime Minister stands up and says, oh, but we've got a capital gains tax on people who are traders in property. No, we haven't. They are paying income tax on their trading activities. They are not paying taxes on their capital gains. They are paying income tax on the change in value of their trading stock, because they're traders. Just like someone who buys and sells shoes pays income tax on trading shoes, or supermarkets on the goods they sell. If you're a trader in property, it is your stock in trade, and you pay taxes on your profits on your trading as income tax, not as a capital gains tax. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand's tax system is fundamentally flawed. We face a higher cost of capital in New Zealand because of our prolonged current account deficit and our DIS savings. And again, what would the OECD and the IMF say is the right thing to get New Zealand people saving rather than over-investing in property and fooling themselves that they're wealthier because the price of the asset has gone up, even though it's just the same asset and the country's no wealthier as a consequence. It's the same thing that existed at the start of the year. It's just the number that attached to it has changed. They would say, well, to fix that, you need a capital gains tax. So you come back to this absolutely central thing that is important both from an economic growth perspective and an equity system, and this bill does nothing about it. One more thing, sir. This bill does nothing to remove the over-taxation New Zealanders are facing through ACC. ACC is meant to be a levy that reflects costs. It is being used as a tax. It's being used by the government to overtax New Zealanders $700 million over the next 2 years, the effect of which allows them to squeak into surplus. And it's good that we're getting back to surplus, but they shouldn't pretend that they are using ACC anything other than as a taxation when it is meant to be a levy which reflects costs. They've already announced in those out years, around the time of the election somewhat coincidentally, they're going to drop those levies after they get back to surplus. Mr. Speaker, we are supporting this bill to Select Committee, but it doesn't make the changes that the New Zealand economy needs.
Julianne.